The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We're going to give folks just another minute or two to join the webinar. Just to orient you, the handouts of the slides are actually there in the handouts section. The webinar is being recorded, and so we will share this with folks here who registered for the webinar, and then you can share it with anyone else who maybe was not able to attend. So please hold on for just a moment while we have other attendees join us. Lauren, I just want to check with you. Is the audio all right?
Is it? I just muted myself,
Okay.
but I'm unmuted now.
Okay, terrific. Okay, I see that folks are still trickling in, but I want to be mindful of everyone's time and get started. So I will first introduce myself. My name is Rebecca Munich. I'm the Deputy Director of the Ecology Center, and I have worked at the Ecology Center for 15 of the last 18 years, focused on environmental health and toxics. And so the PFAS crisis in our state is certainly something that we are very concerned about at the Ecology Center. And we wanted to share a little information with you all, primarily health professionals. Some of you have gone through our Health Leaders Fellowship program and learned about a number of different toxic chemicals and their health impacts in our state and beyond. And we haven't yet communicated much about PFAS chemicals to folks, and so we wanted to use this opportunity to share some information with you all. Some of you who are joining, this will be a reminder in some cases. This is sort of an introductory level, but we hope to bring in other additional experts in the future to speak about specific things. So this is going to be a more broad presentation covering what these chemicals are generally, some of the health effects of them, and then digging in a little deeper into a number of different places where we have contamination in the state of Michigan, and then closing with what can folks do, particularly with a lens as health professionals and scientists, what's needed now to address the PFAS crisis in our state. So if you will, please do use the question option at the bottom of your panel, on the side panel there, to ask any questions during the webinar. The webinar, again, it will be recorded, and so if we can't get to all those questions, we'll certainly address some of those later on. Also, just so that you know, you are in listen-only mode, and I believe I do have a possibility of unmuting folks. We'll see if I'm able to do that on this webinar. So you can raise your hand for that, and then I will try to unmute you during the Q&A period at the end. All right, so what we found out in Michigan is that we have a serious problem with a ubiquitous amount of chemicals found everywhere in the environment here in our state. And one of the things that we wanted to start with is, why are there so many PFAS chemicals in our water, in soil, in the products actually that we use every day. So some folks who may be familiar with the Ecology Center know that we also work on product testing of consumer products to see if they have toxic chemicals in them. And I'm not going to go into great detail on this call today about that, but we are doing some testing of PFAS chemicals right now. These chemicals are so common in our environment because they're so common in the things that we use every day. PFAS chemicals, which I'll go into in a moment, are a large class of chemicals that have been used for things such as nonstick coatings like your Teflon pans, food packaging that might be grease, oil, or water resistant, making your fabrics water repellent or stain resistant. So your Gore-Tex and your Scotchgard products there. Folks may also, if you're following the PFAS crisis in Michigan in the media, and there has been a tremendous amount of coverage from various media outlets, you'll also probably have heard that firefighting foams are another source of contamination into the environment. That's something that we'll cover later with an example from Oscoda, Michigan, and the contamination there from the Wordsmith Air Force Base. And then finally, I guess one additional one is these chemicals are often used in various industrial processes to make products. For example, they're used as surfactants. And one of the examples we'll talk about later in the webinar is actually the contamination right here in my neck of the woods in the Huron River watershed, and the use of PFAS chemicals or surfactants for chrome plating and auto parts manufacturing. So those are some of the examples of how we have PFAS chemicals in our everyday lives and products. Almost all folks in the US and internationally actually have PFAS chemicals in their bodies, upwards of 99% of us. So this is something that is in our environment, in the products we use every day, and in our bodies. So briefly, what are PFAS chemicals? So we used to actually refer to these chemicals in our work here at the Ecology Center as PFCs, or polyfluorinated chemicals. But now we've gotten more specific with the terminology here. And PFAS chemicals are really a large class of chemicals of per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. You can see a couple of images there. There are generally two broad types of PFAS chemicals. The long chain chemicals that you may have heard of called C8. Those are your PFOA chemical, and PFAS. Those are specific chemicals in that long chain family. And then the short chain family, or sometimes called Gen X, which has actually been from our perspective, a regrettable substitution for the long chain chemicals. There are around 5,000 PFAS substances known, and around 3,000 of them are found in commercial use. So with all of these chemicals being used, actually, let me back up for a moment. The one thing I will say is we have moved out of the long chain chemicals in production and usage here, and substituted again, as I mentioned, for those short chain chemicals. One of the problems with that is we are learning more and more about the short chain chemicals and how very persistent they are in the environment. So they're sticking around in our watersheds, and how mobile they are. Actually, maybe even in comparison to the long chain chemicals. So when you're thinking about moving through groundwater or surface water, that's something that's particularly important to think about, as well as filtering those out. And we'll get to a bit of filtration later in the presentation. So how do these chemicals get from our environment into our body? There are a number of different ways there. We're hearing a lot about drinking water and drinking water consumption, and that is an obvious way when our rivers, like our Huron River here in Ann Arbor, is contaminated with PFAS chemicals, which is the source of our drinking water in Ann Arbor. Those chemicals end up in that water and have to be removed. They have to be filtered out, or they end up in the water that we drink here. And Ann Arbor has had tests of drinking water that have shown at 14 parts per trillion going back for a number of years. I believe it was around 2014 was when that testing first showed up. You can also get exposure from inhalation, particularly if, let's say, again, you have contaminated water in your home and you have liquid droplets or vapor suspended in the air. That's a possible source of contamination. And then also food contamination. Now, this is likely to come through contaminated soil, rainwater, and groundwater, and things like fruits and vegetables actually taking that up. Or when you think about fish, for example, and we'll talk about some of the fish advisories here in Michigan, the fact that fish have these chemicals building up in their bodies, and then when we consume them, we also have exposure that way. Skin absorption is possible, but it's less readily available for exposure that way. But it's important to consider that these chemicals, again, remain in our body for many years after our initial exposure and are not processed out as quickly as some other chemicals that at least some of our fellows may be familiar with, like phthalates or bisphenols. They're more common in sort of the sticking around the body as some of the flame retardants that we have discussed before that are more persistent and bioaccumulative. So there is a growing body of literature looking at the health risks and links to different health effects of PFAS chemicals. And again, it's important to consider that we have a lot of information already about the long-chain chemicals, those that have been phased out of manufacture, and growing in bodies of literature looking at those short-chain chemicals and what they can do to our bodies. So I'm not going to go through in detail any of these, but what we can do is pull up a few articles to send to folks if you're interested in digging into some of the health effects associated with PFAS chemicals and some of the literature there. So one piece to talk about a little bit more is cancer risks. The International Agency for Research on Cancer through the World Health Organization has classified one of those long-chain chemicals, PFOA, as possibly carcinogenic to humans and linked to testicular and kidney cancers. The US EPA Scientific Advisory Board, again, says there suggested evidence for carcinogenity of PFOA, that, again, one of the longer chain PFAS chemicals. So who's most vulnerable here? As with many chemical hazards that we have spoken about with our fellows, pregnant women, the fetus and newborns are particularly vulnerable. But the vulnerability doesn't really stop just there. Again, these chemicals have impacts on the developing body. I would add babies and children to that list too, as folks that we should be particularly concerned about their vulnerability to these toxic chemicals. Again, keep in mind that they stay in our bodies, and so they can have both impacts at a critical developmental window for a fetus or a child, or have that accumulation over time, that persistence in our bodies over time and impacts over time. So that timing of exposure, again, is critical here in terms of thinking about PFAS contamination. So we know that these chemicals are found in the products that we use every day, and sometimes in the industrial processes that are obviously creating those products. If their discharge is coming out into air emissions or water emissions, but what about the products that we're using and things that may be coming out from our day-to-day use? This is something that we've been looking into at the Ecology Center and many of our partners. One example that I will give that is not necessarily something that we're seeing at a large level here in Michigan, but something that folks are studying is compostable foodware is often treated, if it is fiber-based, with PFAS chemicals. And there have been some more recent studies showing that those chemicals are then breaking down in the compost as the product is intended to break down, but the PFAS chemicals are coming out in leachate or actually in the compost itself that is then being reapplied to folks' gardens or things along those lines. So that's sort of a consumer product side of things as how these chemicals can end up in the environment. What we've seen in Michigan is a number of different things. The firefighting training runoff, or actually not necessarily just training, but usage when to put out fires on airports or Air Force bases or any other sort of hydrocarbon fire when the fluorinated firefighting foams are used has been a significant issue with contamination in multiple sites around the state of Michigan. So Oscoda is an example we'll talk about, but there are many other bases in the state of Michigan, Air Force or National Guard, that also have contamination. So again, chemical manufacturers or industries that are using PFAS chemicals, such as the Tri-Bar manufacturer upstream of us here in the Wixom area that was using PFAS chemicals for chrome plating, can also be a source of emission into wastewater. But air deposition is something that we're starting to look at too. So if PFAS chemicals are coming out in the air and then depositing onto soil, we want to learn more here at the Ecology Center about that and how these chemicals can then run off from contaminated soil or build up in the food chain again from that side of things. So you can see there's a photo from the DEQ that shows a number of different ways that leachate can come into wastewater treatment, industrial sources going into rivers and so on there. So a number of different ways that these chemicals move out of products or manufacturing processes into our environment. So I want to move to some snapshots of a couple of examples here in Michigan. The first one that I want to highlight is really the first one that we learned about. And unfortunately, the Smith Air Force Base near Oscoda, Michigan, had been using firefighting foam with PFAS chemicals in it for a very long time to do trainings on their Air Force Base to extinguish fires and go in various training exercises. There were also a couple of there was a forest fire in the 1980s and a bus garage fire where the Air Force Base came and helped and used those foams again to put out some of those more municipal fires. Unfortunately, such a large amount of firefighting foam was used that it was a massive contamination of groundwater. And this is something that we have known about for quite some time, almost 7, 8, 9 years ago, when a DEQ staffer, Bob Delaney, started really looking at PFAS contamination around Oscoda and was working to get some of the first fish advisories passed in the Ausable River, the lower part of that, and Clark's Marsh in the area. We at the Ecology Center and some of our partners in the Michigan Network for Children's Environmental Health had talked with Bob at that time and did some outreach. Unfortunately, the state was really unwilling to take any action beyond the fish advisories at that point in around 2012, 2013. Robert Delaney put together a report about the extent of the contamination and risks of there being other contaminated sites. And we recently we recently had that report come to light. It had been suppressed, unfortunately, by the state. And so that information wasn't available to residents about the extent of contamination, and research that really could have tipped us off to what the scale of the problem that we have here in our state. And I want to back up just for a moment to talk about the scale of that problem. Michigan is doing quite a bit of testing for 24 different PFAS analytes, or types of PFAS chemicals. And that's good. It's, as I mentioned, it should have been happening a long time ago, but it is at least happening now. There are other actions that were unacceptable for the state, for example, to suppress that report that I just mentioned, and that further action hasn't been taken to have a lower maximum contaminant level, to lower that threshold, which I'll talk about later in the presentation, and some other actions there. So you may hear in the media that Michigan is leading the country on PFAS. And I think it's a more complicated issue than that. We are testing for more analytes than most other states. We are finding more contamination than most other states. That is a complicated issue as well, because we are, a heavy industrial state. I think that we are going to find out that states like Michigan that have industry, particularly things along the lines as auto, or we'll talk about parchment, so paper, other products that have been treated with PFAS chemicals. In other areas that have that similar sort of industry, we're going to see in other states additional contamination. So I back away for a moment from the industrial side of things and focus again on sort of the Department of Defense, and the various military bases, be they Air Force or National Guard and so on. So again, we know that Wurtsmith should have been the wake-up call for our state to really look 6, 7, 8 years ago at contamination. It's good that we're looking now, but we have a lot of work to do. There are many other bases in Michigan that have contamination with PFAS chemicals. Some of those are closer to the base. They haven't necessarily reached drinking water in all areas, but Selfridge, Battle Creek, Sawyer up in Gwinn, Michigan, Alpena and Camp Grayling are a few other examples here, where PFAS firefighting foam was used, and there's contamination there. So close to home for us here at the Ecology Center is contamination related to wastewater discharge from industrial sources and contaminating our Huron River watershed here in Oakland and Washtenaw, and other counties here in Southeast Michigan. This contamination is likely to, part of it has already been traced back to Tri-Bar Manufacturing Incorporated, which is an auto parts manufacturer that did chrome-plated plastic production for the auto industry. Tri-Bar has said that they have moved out of using the PFOA and PFAS chemicals in 2015, and that the effluent that had been coming from their pipes was just left in the pipes in the water treatment and was still coming out. We've had extraordinarily high levels here in the Huron River, so high that our drinking water here in Ann Arbor, they're taking extra steps in terms of filtration to ensure that as that contamination moves through the river, that we're protecting our drinking water here. And also there have been very strong fish advisories. In fact, do not eat the fish advisories for the whole Huron River watershed. It's possible that there are other sources. Other sources are being investigated right now. I think that what we'll see in Southeast Michigan, because we are such a hub of industry, that there may be other sources that are contributing to those high levels in the Huron River watershed. So that's an example of sort of an industrial contamination. In the same vein, we have folks have probably heard of Wolverine Worldwide. That's the shoe company that makes shoes like Hush Puppies and other common brand names that we probably have in many of our closets. Those chemicals were used to make those shoes waterproof, water resistant. Again, if you think back to that early slide of why PFAS chemicals are used, you have that treatment of textiles for either stain resistance and or waterproofing. So this is the Kent Lake Watershed, and you can see that's up there a bit north of the Grand Rapids area. And a number of drinking water wells were contaminated from contaminated groundwater. So a little bit different in the way that this is shaped up, in that the contamination in the Huron River was surface water versus groundwater. I'm not going to get into all of the details there, but so just so that folks know, groundwater and surface water have different ways that they move, that chemicals move through them. And so we're going to see different sort of natural histories, if you will, of these contaminated sites as the chemicals either move through groundwater or move through surface water. So again, we have drinking water from the groundwater contaminated wells there in the Plainsfield Township, Rockford, Michigan area. I should back up to say there are some incredible citizen action groups. Michigan Demands Action in Plainsfield Township and Now Need Our Water up in the Oscoda area that have been doing great work to educate their communities and advocate for action at the state level and at the federal level to address these PFAS chemicals. And I think what's particularly inspiring to me as an environmentalist and an organizer is the work that they have done to both address their immediate concerns and then see that this is an issue that is affecting communities across the state. What I'm hoping will come out of this webinar is a way for us as advocates, as health professionals, as scientists to also wrap our arms around those communities and be able to add our voices to that fight, to continue to raise the profile of this issue and to push for further policy action in the future. So one last chemical manufacturing industry example. So we're back on the west side of the state here in Parchment, Michigan, near Kalamazoo, where you have surface and well water contamination with PFAS chemicals. These levels, when they were found, were sky high, and the folks in Parchment were fortunately, when those were detected in the state's testing, moved to the Kalamazoo water system. So they are on Kalamazoo drinking water rather than the previous source of water. There are a number of different companies in that area that had done packaging and paper processing that use PFAS chemicals to give the paper products particular characteristics. So you have a landmill where those paper making wastes were dumped, and then again that water coming out, the leachate coming out of the landfill for the contamination in Parchment. One thing, and we can share this with you, I hear that the sound keeps cutting out. So if folks will keep me posted on that, hopefully we can get it so it doesn't. But let me know if the sound does cut out again. Okay. So going back to Parchment, these are things, all of these examples are just a few that are making headlines in the news, but we're learning about more and more contamination at different levels. We are also learning about the need to lower our, or there's strong calls to action, and we believe there's a need to lower our action levels for drinking water contamination. So when the folks from Parchment were moved to the Kalamazoo water system, there were detections of around 19 parts per trillion of PFAS chemicals in that that water source, not source, excuse me, the finished water coming out of the plant. That's higher than the action level for PFAS chemicals in certain places, such as New Jersey. So when we get towards the end of the presentation, I'm going to talk about a few policy recommendations that we have at the Ecology Center. So again, please let me know if the sound goes out again. So as I mentioned, the Department of Environmental Quality is doing extensive testing across the state of a number of different environmental media. So statewide municipal drinking water testing and surface water testing and groundwater testing all over. They are probably a bit more than halfway through that testing now. And again, as I mentioned, testing for 24 different analytes or types of PFAS chemicals. They've shared that data with the Ecology Center, and our science team is looking through that, as well as the fish contamination monitoring from the state's Eat Safe Fish program, which is a combination of work with the Department of Health and Human Services and the DEQ to test fish in the state for various contaminants. So if folks have seen those advisories before, you may be familiar with mercury contamination or PCBs or dioxin and other chemicals being listed. PFAS chemicals, again, have been showing up, and there have been advisories at least since 2012, I believe, was when the advisory came out in the Oscoda, in the Clarks Marsh, and Au River. Again, I mentioned surface water sampling, and one of the things that I believe is starting now, or not as far along as some of the other sampling, is foam on surface water. So the DEQ is communicating with folks in the Oscoda area about sampling foam, and some of the foam in the Huron River has been tested, and there may be other places. Unfortunately, I'm not aware of where that testing is happening right now. The foam testing is also of interest to us here at the Ecology Center. As I mentioned, we test consumer products for PFAS chemicals, and we actually have a report coming out on children's car seats October 30th, where we will have some data on that particular set of products and PFAS chemicals. We're also exploring testing foam so that we can do some of that as well, and a little watchdogging here in the state on what we're finding, looking at PFAS chemicals beyond the PFOA and the PFAS, which are those long chain chemicals, to test for more analytes or total fluorine to see what the total composition of the PFAS chemicals are in that foam. So again, I mentioned this. This is just a little bit of data on what has been tested for in the state of Michigan. As you can see there, there are 938 samples from different community water supplies. On the right hand of the slide are the list of the analytes. All school water is being tested as well, and they're using several different methodologies for that testing. The data, if folks are interested, let us know, is broken up into, you can see the PFOA and the PFAS. Again, I don't know if you can see my cursor actually, but here are those long chain ones, and then other total PFAS chemicals, and you can break it down from there. So fish. This is something, again, that Michigan Department of Health and Human Services has their Eat Safe Fish guidelines. The do not eat the fish value for PFAS is 300 parts per billion. The Kent Lake and Argo Pond fish, which is on the Huron River watershed, tested over that guideline. At first, there was a do not eat the fish advisory just sent for those areas that tested that high, but then as additional testing was done throughout the watershed, the do not eat the fish advisory was set for the entire watershed. We're not alone here in the Huron River. As I have mentioned before, they have do not eat the fish advisories in Clark's Marsh and Lower Au Sable since 2012 in the Oscoda area. And I anticipate that we may be seeing more fish advisories going forward. These are just the do not eat the fish advisories. The Eat Safe Fish Guide also has advisories at lower levels for the size, how many portions you're supposed to eat, or they consider safe to eat in a month. So we didn't include that information here, but it's something that we're hoping to have a presentation from the folks at the state about the Eat Safe Fish guidelines and with specific questions related to PFAS to get more details to folks like you all who may be interested in that. So we will keep you posted as those plans develop. So again, this is just a slide to show a little bit about the surface water sampling in the Huron River watershed that was done just in July of this year. As you can see, these are parts per trillion measures. And as you can see, that surface, they're nanograms per liter. It's right there. You can see the larger red ones are the higher levels, and then going down to even your non-detect. And so you can see all along the river watershed where you have, again, some of your sources up here at the higher levels, closer to where the contamination was coming in. And then you see, as we move down, you can see various contamination levels of surface water there as well. So water sampling for PFAS chemicals here in our Ann Arbor drinking water began in early 2016. The sources tested were treated samples from our main water reservoir, untreated samples from the river itself, untreated surface water from the Huron River, and then certain places like Barton Pond and Honey Creek along the watershed, and groundwater from two raw water production wells. So 4 of the 5 untreated surface water samples tested above the EPA's PFAS criteria level of 70 parts per trillion. And then 46 of 59 water samples also contained other levels of detectable PFAS. We aren't satisfied with that 70 parts per trillion number. Over the summer, a report that had initially been suppressed by the EPA and the White House from the ATSDR, the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry of the CDC, recommended much lower levels than 70 parts per trillion, 10 or so stages lower than that, around 7 or 10 parts per trillion for the longer chain PFAS chemicals. So again, why is there a fish advisory? You can see some of the parts per billion in fish that were tested from these various lakes along, lakes and other areas along the Huron River watershed. And you can see they're very high here in Kent Lake, and then a bit lower in some of the other areas, but still concerning areas when you think of that. Do not eat the fish advisory is 300 parts per billion. So a number of potential sources have been identified or are being explored for the Ann Arbor or Huron River watershed PFAS contamination. Again, the Wixom wastewater treatment plant treats and discharges industrial wastewater upstream, and their effluent tested in this summer was 290 nanograms per liter. Excuse me. So they're working right now. The state is working to control those discharges and doing monitoring the effluent on a monthly basis. I mentioned that the Tribar Manufacturing Incorporated former automotive facility upstream that was doing the chrome plating, actually not not necessarily former, excuse me. There are some other possible sources, a landfill in Lyon Township, some discharges that have been permitted near Kent Lake, and possible sources from airports, Willow Run, and so on, and another landfill there in Willow Run Creek. So we've talked a lot about how ubiquitous these chemicals are in our environment, be they in our water, our surface water, our groundwater, our drinking water, in the fish that we enjoy catching and eating here in Michigan, and even in other things like the products in our homes. So unfortunately, PFAS chemicals are not listed in CERCLA, or the Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation and Liability Act, and they are not listed as Superfund hazardous substances, which can make it more difficult in terms of cleanup of PFAS contaminated sites. These chemicals are also not well regulated by the US EPA in terms of drinking water. They are those two long-chain chemicals, PFOA and PFAS, are identified as priority contaminants, but the drinking water health advisory levels are non-enforceable and non-regulatory. Their advisory level, again, is 70 parts per trillion. That has been adopted by the state of Michigan. One of the challenges with that is the state of Michigan has been suggesting that's a safe level in drinking water, and we have learned more from the more recent ATSDR report that those levels, in fact, should be much lower by orders of magnitude. So places like Ann Arbor and various other drinking water treatment plants are treating our drinking water by using things like granulated activated carbon and other sorts of filtration methods. What we've seen is some of these are not completely effective for PFAS removal, especially there's some specific concerns with those newer short chain PFAS in breaking through some of the filtration ways of filtering out water. It can be very expensive, and we aren't getting rid of those chemicals forever when we use a filter. We then have a secondary problem of disposing the filters because they too become contaminated. I don't put this out there to have people be dismayed, because we absolutely should be filtering out PFAS chemicals from our drinking water. But it's sort of to just bring up the fact that filtration is not enough, that we still are using various PFAS chemicals, particularly those, short chain chemicals, and we need to address that and stop their usage so that we don't continuously stay on this treadmill of having to have contaminated groundwater and surface water sources leading to our drinking water that has to be filtered, and then we have perhaps not as great of removing all of those chemicals as we would like to have, and then a challenge of the end of life cycle in disposing those filters and wanting to ensure that they are not just coming back out in landfills in contaminating leachate. Right now, the way that is recommended is to incinerate the various filters, but as folks know, there are a number of problems with incineration. There are specific types of incineration to destroy the PFAS chemicals. I am not as familiar. We're looking into more information about that incineration. We're not certain that all of those filters would actually be required because of the poor regulation of PFAS to go to specific incinerators. So ensuring that they're not ending up being disposed of improperly is incredibly important. So the Ecology Center and many of our national partners and some other partners here in Michigan have reached out to our congressional delegation and called for swift action on PFAS chemicals. We are really seen as ground zero in Michigan for the PFAS crisis. And we've been speaking with our partners in various states about what's happening in their states and the testing that is happening and what can be done, sharing best practices and so on. So a couple of the actions that we called for in a recent hearing last month that Senator Peters from Michigan here called were phasing out PFAS chemicals in firefighting foams. Safer alternatives are being used in other countries for those firefighting foams. There is a report that came out from an organization called IPEN that we can send along to folks that demonstrates that airports in other countries, including Australia, Canada, various European countries, New Zealand, South Korea, and Sweden, are in many military bases are not using PFAS containing foams anymore. So London's Heathrow Airport is an example of an airport that's not using firefighting foams containing fluorine, or Dubai, or Stuttgart, or Copenhagen. So there are many different places that have moved out of these toxic chemicals, and that's something that we think should happen in the United States as well. I have some concerns about how quickly things may move at the federal level. And so there are some things in the next slide about state level policy and actions that we can take here in Michigan to not wait on the EPA or on Congress to pass these things. So we think it's important to push on both sides here, federally and at the state level. We also called on Congress to require the polluters to pay for cleanup. Two of the main chemical companies that have produced these chemicals are 3M and Chemours. Chemours was spun off from DuPont, so it may be not a household name there. And then banning the use of PFAS chemicals in manufacturing and so on. We feel it's incredibly important to take preventative action right now. As I mentioned with the filtering, we keep having a problem where sometimes on the waste side of things, contaminants enter our environment and then our bodies as a result after that. And then really calling on the EPA to provide state governments like ours here in Michigan with information and technical assistance to address the crises that we are uncovering with our testing here. So those are a few of the federal actions. There are more specific actions related to the Department of Defense and what they should be doing with cleanup. Congressman Kildee has been a tremendous ally for the community in Oscoda and really pushing for DoD cleanup and to take action and responsibility for the contamination around military sites and bases. So on the state level, in our current session, which ends, after probably around December this year, there isn't a final end date. There are a number of different bills that have been introduced. Here's a sampling of them. I wanted to highlight these two on the left side. The first is Winnie Brink's bill from the west side of the state near Grand Rapids, setting a maximum PFAS and PFOA contaminant level in drinking water at 5 parts per trillion. I think this is great, and we applaud Winnie Brink's for this policy. But I really would like to see it go further. Something that we will be calling for at the Ecology Center is taking a class-based approach to PFAS chemicals so that we're not going through the chemical whack-a-mole by regulating one chemical at a time, having a regrettable substitution that's frankly already happened from the Longchain PFAS chemicals and the shift to short chain chemicals. But addressing them as a class is the way that we think that should happen. We can look towards models in places like New Jersey, which, although it's a smaller set of chemicals, has a lower drinking water maximum contaminant level, or MCL, for 4 different PFAS chemicals. And I believe that throughout the next year or so, we'll see a number of other examples coming out of other states that are terrific and that we should emulate here in Michigan. The next one is a bipartisan bill in the House that would prohibit the use of PFAS-containing firefighting foams in training exercises. Again, we think this is a really good first step, but that expanding that usage to all firefighting foam makes sense. The state of Washington this year has a ban on PFAS firefighting foam, and a recent change by the FAA that regulates airports will now cracks open the possibility that states can actually take action to not use these PFAS-containing firefighting foams on airports. So the Washington state ban initially couldn't touch airports because they're regulated under the FAA, but the recent FAA, in the last month or so, reauthorization has cracked open that possibility. So states can start to pass those bans. One of the things about state level policy and how important it is folks probably are aware that it takes a very long time for congressional action on numerous different issues. And states can really be the laboratories of change for model policy. And I think because of the extent of the crisis that we have here in Michigan, we should be leading the nation. Even though the state government has said we are, I don't feel that we are yet leading the nation in addressing the PFAS crisis. And so some of these different pieces of policy can do that. In addition to, these are the ones that have been introduced. In addition to that, there are some other actions that we think should be taken either by the state or by others. So I'm going to actually start with the last bullet point here because this is another public policy piece. So that Michigan, we feel should look into banning ongoing uses of PFAS chemicals. I mentioned firefighting in the last slide, but also in various manufacturing processes. And again, thinking about those short chain chemicals that are still being used and looking for safer alternatives to those instead of continuing that usage. Moving up, the second bullet point there is actually taking legal action to sue 3M and Chemours to pay for cleanup and drinking water and filtration and various things like that. So a few years ago, Minnesota did this. They sued 3M, I believe it was, to get some additional cleanup funding, somewhere to the tune of just shy of $900 million for cleanup in the state of Minnesota. That's something that our Attorney General could do, and something that we will be reaching out to whoever is the new Attorney General after the election and encouraging them to file suit against these companies to pay. So the other piece there is a call to action. There's a campaign called Make Them Pay, which is active right now, and I'll give you information on the next slide on how you can take action, calling on 3M and Chemours to pay for cleanup. And this is a broad call to action that is nationwide. A petition is circulating and growing, and so we encourage folks to join us in taking action right now. So I'm going to move on to what you can do. This is the first thing you can do there. And it's a small step. It's something that can be done today. The Ecology Center is working again with national allies on the Make Them Pay campaign. At the bottom of the slide there, you can see you can just text toxic to that number, or go to nonsticknightmare.org to sign the petition. And we want to collect as many signatures as we can. And I think it's really important to have a large number of people from Michigan signing on, since again, we really are truly ground zero for this contamination in the United States. So I encourage everyone to take a moment today and to sign on to that petition. But that's a first easy step. I also wanted to highlight the importance of raising health professional voices. We've talked with community activists in Oscoda and Plainsfield Township, the Rockford area, and others, and some of our other environmental allies. And we're not hearing health professional voices like we should on this issue. So this is my plea to you all to join us in this fight. So that we have public health professionals and clinicians talking about these issues, working with us here at the Ecology Center, especially those fellows who are currently in our program. These are parts of work that will be part of your practicum projects that will be getting underway shortly. But other health professional voices are badly needed, and we hope that you'll be interested in working with us. There are things that are fairly easy to do, like writing an opinion editorial, and we'd like to have those in areas of the state, all over the state, talking about contamination in your neck of the woods. Again, I can't stress how much health professional voices are needed right now to be media spokespeople. When you're seeing all of these various articles coming out, and we're not necessarily seeing health professionals coming out in front. That is critically important when we meet with lawmakers as well. As many of you know, certain health professionals like nurses are among the most trusted voices in our society. So if we can bring nurses and doctors and public health professionals with us when we meet with our congressional delegation or Michigan senators and representatives at the state legislature, that message from you is much better received than it is from us as an environmental organization. So we'll have opportunities. We'll be reaching out to all of the new all of the new elected officials after the election with this information, and bringing folks to Lansing with us or to meetings with congressional members to talk about various policy proposals, the health impacts of these chemicals, and what folks can do. I'm working with a health professional now to provide patients with information about PFAS. If you're a clinician, you may be getting questions about this. So we can help with some example materials that you could have in your practice to talk to families and parents and grandparents about PFAS chemicals if they're in your drinking water, or if you fish, what you should be looking out for or avoiding in terms of PFAS chemicals. So that's another opportunity there. So there's a number of different things that folks can do at various levels. Really, to volunteer for any of these actions, you just need to let me know that you're interested. I will, of course, be following up with our fellows in the fellowship program. But for folks who have joined the webinar who aren't a part of that program, please do send me an email and let me know if you're interested in these, or if you have other ideas. We're certainly open to those as well. That's the end of the formal presentation. My contact information is up there on the screen, but I want to just take a moment and answer any questions that folks have. So go ahead if you want to raise your hand, or if you want to type a question into the question box below. And again, sorry about those technical difficulties with the sound earlier. Hopefully it improved. Give folks a moment here. Okay. The first question that we have is, how do we access specifics for our own area? I live in northern Michigan, only 16 miles from Camp Grayling. I would like information about the Au Sable River. I fly fish. That's a great question. So the state does have information on their MPART website, and unfortunately, I don't have that URL available. Maybe Lauren, can you look and type that in and send that to folks if you're still listening in there? So you can look to find out where the testing has happened in terms of by Camp Grayling and also the Au Sable River. On the Au Sable River, definitely go to look at the Eat Safe Fish information by the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services. So if you just Google Eat Safe Fish, that should come up, and you can find out what the fish advisories are on the Au Sable River and what parts of the river, because it's the lower parts of the river, so depending there. We have a question about the slides. Would they be available after the webinar? They're available right now. If you look in the handout section, you can see the PFAS Introduction Ecology Center PDF that has all of the slides. And if you have any trouble downloading that from the webinar here, do just send me an email and I will happily shoot those over to you. Another question here, there was a forest fire directly in a woods next to someone's home, who to contact. I would reach out to the DEQ. Again, go visit that MPART website and find the contacts there. They should have a place for questions or concerns and let folks know, regarding that fire. And they may or may not have done any testing in the water around there. I'm not certain. Okay. Another question was, do landfills routinely check for PFAS in their leachate? Honestly, I actually don't know if the landfills themselves are testing for routinely. I mean, they may be testing now, but I'm not sure that they were previously for PFAS chemicals. So it's a good question, and we will look into that and follow up. The next question is, a fellow from a previous year of our fellowship program watched a documentary on firefighters and exposure to fire retardants and health effects. What is the name of that documentary? That is likely Toxic Hot Seat, and I think it may be available on Netflix now. It was available for some time on HBO that you could stream, and that's something that for our health fellows, we do have a copy of that, and we certainly could to do a showing for folks there. So yeah, Toxic Hot Seat. That's a great example. And actually, Jessica, I'm really glad that you bring that up, because what we're seeing with PFAS is very similar to what we've seen with certain toxic flame retardants. And I've mentioned a couple times regrettable substitution. In Michigan, and actually nationally, we passed some policies in 2000 and, I get my years right, 2004, I believe, to phase out two types of flame retardants called PBDEs, or polybrominated diphenyl ethers. It was something that we worked on at the Ecology Center here, and then we tried to close the door on a third one, Deca BDE. Unfortunately, we were not successful with banning that in Michigan. But those, because of statewide action in Michigan and in many other states, those chemicals were phased out of usage voluntarily at the national level, and are not as often found in products that we use on a day-to-day basis. I actually see that Dr. Rick Radisky is on the webinar, and he has done some terrific testing in the state of Michigan on those PBDE chemicals in fish, and is also, I believe, looking into PFAS chemicals in fish as well, and found that that fish all over our state and bodies of water over the state are contaminated with these chemicals. This is a long way of saying that we worked to get PBDE flame retardant chemicals out of production, but industry switched to other flame retardant chemicals, unfortunately. So again, regrettable substitution, moving to chlorinated flame retardants and other things along those lines. And so we had to sort of tackle the next class there. That is why I think it's so important that we in Michigan and then also at the federal level look at PFAS chemicals as a class rather than going one by one. The next question here is, should individuals be checking their well water for PFAS? And if so, what is the best way to do this? Or is this currently recommended primarily for people in known contamination zones? That is a great question. I will look into the best way to do that and which labs we could recommend for folks and get back to you all about that. I don't know, Lauren, I don't know if you and Jeff have done any research on that and if you could chime in on that aspect. I think that the second part of the question, is this currently recommended for primarily for people in known contamination zones, is that we keep finding contamination zones. And so in a lot of ways, I'm concerned about our unknowns as well. Certainly, if you have groundwater contamination or surface water contamination nearby, that would be a concern. But I wouldn't rest on our laurels that we're not going to continue to find more and more contamination in other areas. So we will get back to folks in terms of how and where you could get your drinking water wells tested for PFAS chemicals. Great question. Let's give folks a moment. All right. If we don't have any other additional chemical or questions about PFAS chemicals, we will wrap up the webinar now and a little bit early here. Thank you so much for joining us. Please do reach out to me. We hope to work with you all on this issue and get you engaged in various market or policy efforts on addressing the PFAS crisis. Again, thanks all for joining, and please do feel free to share the slides. We'll also have the recording here shortly and send that out to folks, and you can share that widely as well. Thank you very much.